All right, so to examine some of the media recommendations component of that EU report, we're heading to Abuja. Marpe.
Thank you, Chamberlain. We're now being joined by two very gentlemen. We have with us Professor Tony Iredia, who is a former Director General of the Nigeria Television Authority. He's currently a visiting professor at the Igbinedion University. Prof, you're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much.
We also have with us Professor Armstrong Idachaba, who is the Director Broadcast Monitoring at the Nigerian Broadcasting Commission. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
National Broadcasting Commission.
The National Broadcasting
Thank you, Mark.
Welcome to Sunrise Daily. The European Observer Mission was very extensive in their report. It covered many areas. It covered legal framework. It covered administration and INEC. It also touched on the media as well. They came up with 3 recommendations. One of them a priority recommendation, and the other just 2 recommendations there, which I'm going to read out for the benefit of our viewers. I hope that it will be on the television screen for you to be able to follow. The priority recommendation says, reform the licensing system for broadcast media to provide pluralism and diversity in all states. Ownership structures be publicized, powers to grant licenses be vested in the NBC without presidential approval, and license fees be tailored to the economic circumstances in each state. So the priority recommendations deals heavily with the functions of the Nigerian Broadcast Commission, the National Broadcasting Commission. And then you also have 2 other recommendations there. Transform the National Broadcasting Commission into a genuinely independent media regulatory body, establish institutional transparency and accountability requirements, and the selection of the board and director through an open, inclusive, and competitive system with a cross-party approval mechanism and/or participation of industry professionals. And you also have the 3rd one there, establish a legal and regulatory system that transforms the federal government-owned media, that's the NTA and FRCN, into genuine public service broadcasters. These include provisions for editorial independence, financial autonomy, clear separation from any government institution, and an open and inclusive selection process of the management. Gentlemen, these are far-reaching recommendations which will require some major systemic reforms. Can I get your immediate thoughts looking at these reforms? Let's start with you, Professor Iredia.
Well, thank you very much, Mokpe. I think there's very little to take away from what has been said so far. I have been an advocate for autonomy for the media and for its regulator. I think that the way the National Broadcasting Commission is structured has what I would call some defect, in the sense that it is difficult for them to regulate the media without any accusation of bias. Because the body is appointed by a government that is instituted by a political party, there's a tendency for the management of the organization to dance to the tune of government. I think that it is very easy for government to dissociate itself from what the NBC does. I think that there should be clear-cut, non-partisan NBC, and that does not appear to exist, because the people in NBC as of today are pro-ruling party, and they have always been so. Even when it was not this party that was ruling, the party that was on then was doing exactly the same thing, and we have not been able to do something about that. I think that's an area that we need to look at. I have canvassed in the public domain the idea of having a regulatory body that is what I would say professionally oriented. We need to have people who really are versed in media operations and broadcast, knowledge, not just appointing just anybody who comes there. Sometimes, even when you appoint somebody who's very knowledgeable in media operations, and he's not seen to be impartial, when he even takes good decisions, there's also a tendency for the other party to raise an alarm, especially as it's practically impossible for the organization to deal with all media bodies in a uniform manner. I think this is the reason why we're having problems there. I also agree that in order for information to go round quickly, easily, and in a plural manner, the licensing issue should be looked at again.
We'll come to that shortly.
Right.
But let me quickly take the immediate thoughts of Professor Idachaba, especially in the light, of what you have said, that it's going to be difficult for the NBC to be impartial. Only recently, the NBC was in the news after the suspension of a national broadcast organization. It suspended the license of a major national broadcaster, and some say that the move was not devoid of political interference. Now, this report seems to give some credibility to that. How much political interference would you say that the NBC currently experiences, Professor Idachaba?
Thank you very much, Maope, and it's nice to be on the panel with my senior colleague, my former head of department at Nasarawa State University, where we both lectured. Prof, in your opening comment, while talking about the regulator generally, you said the people in NBC or generally be inclined to a particular political party. I didn't think you took cognizance of the fact that some of us have no obligation to be partisan in any way. We are bureaucrats, we are regulators, and to generalize that everybody in NBC may be partisan may not be exactly true. But listening to the...
But do you think that if the leadership is appointed by the president and can be removed of the whims and caprices of, by the leadership, I'm talking about the management, can be dismissed by the Minister for Information, don't you think that, he does have a point there, because the NBC will definitely take on the color of whoever it is as at the helm of affairs?
Yeah, naturally, yes. I agree with you, especially where it is apparent, it's obvious that somebody is appointed on a strictly partisan basis. Of course, whoever is so appointed will owe allegiance and loyalty to the party that may have so appointed. But again, it also depends sometimes on the personality of the individual. A Professor Iredia, for instance, anywhere you appoint him to as a regulator, I'm sure you'll have at the back of his mind his obligation to his professional ethics. And regardless the partisan coloration of his appointment, his primary objective will be to keep the integrity and credibility of the profession. That's on one side. But talking about the points you made about the EU report generally, as I listen to the points, what I will say, first of all, is that they are not entirely new. And like Professor Iredia said, some of them have even been expressed by him at several fora, basically talking about the licensing regime in the regulator, advocating that the process of licensing be left entirely in the hands of the regulator without necessarily taking some of those licensing aspects to the president. And there are examples to draw from. In many countries, the licensing process is liberalized such that all the processes are done at the level of the regulator, because the regulator is the one who knows the market, is the one who knows the advertising is the one that knows where the need for broadcasting will have to be extended. And it is important to trust the judgment of the regulator. But I think that what has happened in the Nigerian situation over the years is that government feels that broadcasting is such a sensitive segment of the society that even government will have to keep a close eye, for instance, on the licensing process. Of course, but as we are speaking, I think the dynamics are changing globally. And if government takes a second look at it, nothing will hurt us. Then the critical point about the ownership, which you also raised, about government having its hand in the control and running of broadcast stations. It is also important that there should be some, as many people have argued, that there has to be a redefinition of the ownership of the government media. For many people, there's a cloud of definition surrounding even the operational status, to the extent that it is hard to say whether they are public broadcasters or government-owned broadcasters, because many times you see that as much as they offer government information services, they are also involved to some extent in some commercial activity. And that also makes them compete in the market with even the private broadcasters. So government may have to re-examine the general gamut the philosophy, the structure of broadcasting and what role it has to play, especially with regards to ownership. And then finally, the point we made about the composition of the NBC board. It would be great if, as there's cross-partisanship. That will establish and entrench the fundamental principle of pluralism, so that you can have diverse views on the NBC board. It will be great if, as is done in the US and in other countries, where the regulator is even appointed by parliament, in which case the generality of the public space, the political process, not minding which is in power or not, will have a say in the composition of the leadership of the regulator. These are the ways that I think these are debates that are ongoing.
Yeah, but you haven't quite answered, whether or not there is some political interference as we speak in the NBC.
Well, I think you were trying to give the example, of a national broadcaster that was recently suspended. As the director for broadcast monitoring of NBC, I can tell you for sure that the issues surrounding the suspension are not political. They are basically issues that have to do with the conduct of the broadcast station with regards to compliance with ethics of the profession.
I don't know whether you were also privy to the EU report on broadcast monitoring. They monitored some radio and TV stations, and they had a pretty comprehensive report. And some of those, when you look at some of the graphs that were drawn up, it would seem that in the monitoring of broadcast stations, it does seem like as if the NBC dropped the ball. I don't know, have you seen the report?
I've seen the report and I've read it line by line.
Yes.
Quite instructively, there are so many positive commendations that were made by that same report. For instance, I have it here that they said in 2019 that the media enhanced transparency in the electoral process. That's the first line. Basically, that we enhance transparency. They even talked about the credibility, the transparency of the declaration of results.
The media is also the NBC.
I know, it includes also the NBC.
Yes, exactly. Perhaps it does, but what I'm talking about is when you look at, say, the amount of time dedicated, when you look at the coverage time given to government, the party in power, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. In some states, what you notice is that the radio stations devoted almost all their time to just government work or even a political party's work. And that's where it ended. In those kind of situations, we haven't quite heard the NBC say anything or do anything about it. Well,
that you may think that NBC didn't do a thing, but you'll have also realized in that same report that the report also singled out, for instance, Radio Nigeria, and commended Radio Nigeria, though being a federal government station, that the Radio Nigeria offered opportunity for all political parties. And they also said that in some states, there was this attempt to grant pluralism. I was in Osun State during the election, and I monitored during the Osun elections that the state broadcaster, though a state government radio, they allowed all facets of opinion and views.
Yeah, the only place where that commendation came for TV stations was in Lagos State. But let me quickly come to Professor here, because you're not quite hitting that. Professor, you were DG at NTA. As someone who's seen it from inside and outside, how do you take the term transforming the federal government-owned media, the NTA and FRCN, into genuine public service broadcasters? I think I need to point out here that indeed the report did seem to have some praise for the FRCN, but had very little to say in terms of praise for the NTA, which you once headed. They said their support for the president was very, obvious. As someone who's been there, do you think that, is ever going to change?
I think it should be a little bit difficult for it to change, except the structure is changed, except the composition is changed, except the attitude towards, getting right persons on the job. It's going to be quite difficult because the political parties don't seem to know the difference between government and party. So you see somebody who is a member of a political party, he walks up to you and says, "We appointed you." Forgetting that this is somebody holding a government position. And you are trying to trivialize it, or you're trying to politicize it, which shouldn't be. I remember very well that in my days in the NTA, I had a very difficult time trying to explain to government that the law says equal opportunity shall be given to everybody. And if you, the government, did not change that law, why do you want to compel the media to do it your way? In other words, why are you compelling the media to break the law? And this is so. You can see that sometimes when you're talking about, you can hardly bring a difference between what the media stands for and what the government is saying. Look at the controversy, for example, over what INEC does. Sometimes a party man is talking, and he's talking for INEC. Yet INEC has its spokespersons. So it is better to allow INEC to speak for itself. In the same way, it's better to allow the media to do their job. For me, I think that we must go beyond even what the EU is saying. The EU, to me, is looking at voting. But election is not just voting. The coverage of elections in Nigeria is faulty in the sense that we don't take cognizance of the real issues of pre-election time. For example, even channels that everybody is praising, and I mean, I don't think we can take it from channels, they've done quite well. They do a lot of campaigns before 90 days, which the law says should not be done. Then let us be able to follow the rules. Let us know what the rules are. So when people start campaigning before the time for campaigns, you have distracted government into politicization. The
But there's also that thin line, though. I mean, I want to point out that, you know, reporting government activities or reporting governance and reporting what government is doing. How easy is it for anyone to differentiate or to draw the line between government activities and a campaign for elections? Just wondering. I'll give you an instance. A few days before the elections, the government started this program, Trade and Money, which is a new government program. But along the same line, some people felt, wow, it's just coming, you know, a couple of days before the election. Isn't this, you know, something towards the election, for instance? How do you think that, you know, not just the NTA now, but generally broadcast houses, how do they differentiate so that these lines are not blurred?
It's easy. For me, I think what has been missing really is investigative journalism, the capacity to be on the other side of a subject, right? I didn't see much of interrogation of why Trade and Money, for example, came when it came. Rather, we were saying what the government is saying. We should have taken government up to say, how come you are doing it at this point? I would have done the devil's advocacy by insisting on that. You see a lot of people who just produce. I get your point that government activities have to be covered, but we must also get government to speak. Let's come back to elections. When it is said that we should cover all the parties, how do we arrive at this coverage? In those days, we had logbooks by which anybody who wanted to come and find out how much of coverage you have given to another party would see it and be able to say, oh, this has been done. I don't know whether that is still going on now. But we need to do that, and we need to follow up some of these issues that have been done. When somebody is talking, we need to stand on the other side. But when we just parrot what government is doing, then we create an impression that really we are publicizing and we are campaigning. But if we can take government up on why it is doing what it is doing and how the people feel about what it is doing, and even draw attention to the fact that notwithstanding what has been said, government appears to just be on its own. It's not listening. It's not changing. It's not doing what people are talking about. Then we begin to do that. Let me give you an example of one of the things that worried me. The trial of the Chief Justice, right? Everybody was talking about what government has said. We never heard what the Chief Justice said. We never heard it. And yet the principle of balance and objectivity is a prime one in media work. We never heard it. And we were hearing people condemning even before the trial. And even during the trial, comments were being made, and people were pretending that, oh, that's the latest in town, let's talk about it. Yet, we all know that is not the right thing to do when something is already before a court. We should keep quiet. So we need to do a lot of work in media operations, in my opinion.
Let's talk about licensing now. You know, I think there was a lot of talk around licensing as well. Asking government to hands off. I mean, the president doesn't have to approve. But then there's also the prohibitive costs of license. Can you tell us how it works at the NBC and how you arrive at these figures?
Anyway, interestingly, the NBC from inception has been very mindful about the micro and macroeconomics of licensing. To the extent that we have a regime of licensing, the entire broadcasting landscape is segmented according to potentials for economic viability. What you pay for a license, for instance, in the Lagos space, and what you pay for Abuja and Port Harcourt is different from what you pay in other states of the Federation. And that is a policy we intend to continue to keep, because it is obvious that not every region of the country is financially or advertising, the advertising potential is high. So it's a matrix that we are very mindful of.
Is that how you arrive at cost that, reach up to 15 million naira for a 5-year period?
Yes, for Lagos, Abuja, and Kano, yes, it's not even 15; it's 20 million for radio, And if you break that down, if you have to do the calculation, that gives you about 4 million per annum, right? We also know, for instance, that Channels Television, on a very good day, especially during politics, can charge as high as 10 million for a live coverage, right? And we know that it's probably same for many of the broadcasters.
Licensing costs are possibly not the only things that we have to pay.
The point is, we know you have the potential, the capacity to pay, because you are getting the revenues, right? So
I differ, because to start with, there are two issues. One is, I hope the NBC is not trading, because if the NBC is trading, then it can't be on the public space as a regulator. The purpose is to ensure that the media is doing what it is supposed to do. By the time you bring prohibitive costs, you are actually asking the media to go and increase their own dues and advertising rates. I think that's the first one. The second one is that the NBC is subvented from public funds. Government gives it money in the budget and pays the salaries of staff and all that. So what are they doing with the high fees they are charging? So if the NBC is trading, then something is wrong, because at the end of the day, you can't tell me that news is free. When I producing news, I have to look for so much to pay to the NBC. And that will sort of affect, in an adverse manner, the level of opportunities for the ordinary Nigerian to know what is happening. Because if you don't have the money, then you can't be on channels, or you cannot be on any particular channel. So I think that NBC fees are too high. They must be brought down, and NBC must recognize that it wasn't set up to be charging fees, and it must recognize what it is doing.
I think that Professor Iredia got it wrong. The price we are charging is not prohibitive. As I speak with you, there are many people that are applying, and constantly applying to get into the media space, especially in Lagos, in Kano, and Port Harcourt. If it were not attractive, if there are no profits and dividends to get from it, they wouldn't.
So the NBC is trading.
Yes,
no, you are not. Basically, you are not.
Essentially, you are. Because I've just been told now how much you charge for national broadcast license. 500 million. That is prohibitive. I mean, that is in addition to what the broadcasters have to worry about, electricity costs. I mean, the overheads in general that they have to worry about. And as Professor just pointed out, it means essentially that what you're saying is that news is not free, because at the end of the day, these broadcasters have to worry about paying their license fees every now and again. Otherwise, what happened to a national broadcaster?
You see, again, we have to get it right.
Yes.
Frequency and spectrum, right, is a valuable resource all over the world, right? The broadcast frequency you use, telecom companies, other service providers are also seeking to use that frequency. And don't make the mistake as if whatever the NBC charges is spent 100% by the NBC.
But we haven't heard that the NBC is giving as huge sums as JAMB recently gave to the coffers of the federal government, for instance.
Come to NBC and check our books and find out what we remit to government.
Is that what NBC is set up for?
That's one. And then two, there's also the question of transparency. Yeah. Because part of what has come up here is also the issue of transparency. How do you come about these figures in such a manner that everybody can see how it is that you've come about it? And even in terms of, well, I think that's another kettle of things. I think in terms of sanctions, for instance, they say oftentimes what the NBC does is put blanket penalties on almost everybody without saying very clearly what it is that they have.
I'm surprised you are saying there's the broadcast code. Don't you have a copy of the broadcast code? I have it here. For each breach, right? For each breach of the broadcast code, there's a category of sanction. Either it is class A or B or C. The category of fine is also clearly spelled out in the code.
We will take a moment. I will come back and ask if those penalties
let me ask Dr. whether he was not making money at the NTA. He was generating a lot of revenue at the NTA. Why was he doing so?
We'll continue this conversation. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We'll still have with us in the studio Professor Tony Iredia, who is a former DG of the NTA, that's National Television Authority, and is a visiting professor at the Igbinedion University. And we also have with us Professor Armstrong Idachaba, who is the Director Broadcast Monitoring at the National Broadcasting Commission. Gentlemen, just before we went on break, we're talking about the fines of the NBC. I want to read from the report now. It says the NBC fined 45 national and state-level media outlets for various breaches of campaign coverage rules. Decisions obtained by the EOM showed that some of the outlets were excessively penalized for minor infringements. The NBC did not explain why all broadcasters received the same fine of 500,000 naira, despite this being much more difficult for a state-level FM radio to pay than for a national outlet. Do you want to comment quickly on that?
Yeah, very simple. That provision of the Broadcast Act is also replicated in the Electoral Act, that where there are infringements regarding political broadcast, especially during the prohibition period, 24 hours during election. The Act stipulates a fine of 500,000. So it's a fine that is stipulated and fixed by the law.
So the law, I mean, the NBC can actually come up with different fees based on what you hope that, or what you think that each broadcaster can make from, separate areas, but doesn't come up with that. It doesn't reflect in the penalties, which is stipulated by the code.
If you look at the code again, and Maupe, I advise you and other broadcasters, take your time to look at the broadcast code. Like I was telling you, the fine sanction procedure in the Broadcast Act is very clear. It's enunciated in the code. There are fines that are as low as 50,000. Fine. There are fines that they are categorized depending on the level of the breach. There are fines that are, the maximum fine, for instance, is about 999, right? So, but in this particular one, like I said, it's a fine that is stipulated in the Electoral Act. For other breaches that are not at the point of the election period, breaches regarding advertising, breaches regarding indecency, they are, in fact, for community broadcast stations, community radio and TV stations, the code clearly says that their fine should be light fine because they are not in the business to maximize profit like Channels Television. So their fines are as little as 50,000.
We have no apologies for that, and I hope that you're well. We have absolutely no apologies for that. But Prof, let me take you up on some of the vague aspects which the recommendations of the European Union Observer Mission touched on, which is that some of the things that the regulations touch on are quite vague. When it says that something should be in good taste, for instance, and should not be, I'm trying to look for the word now, I can't quite find the term here. They say it impedes, what it does is that it doesn't make it transparent when it is that a broadcast outfit can be hit. You can be doing something and you're not sure if it's in good taste. How clearly do you think that the NBC codes are spelled out, and why has there been, if it's not clearly spelled out, why has there been some reluctance to change it?
Well, I think that there's so much to be done to the NBC Act. Armstrong here has been talking about fines and fines and fines, but he has not remembered that NBC is an administrative body. And so there's a limit to its powers to impose fines on people. That's something that the court of law should do. So when you just go up there and say suspended or somebody is fined and all of that, you are also the one fining, you are the one implementing, you are the one making the decisions. And that doesn't go too well with the rule of law. I think there's a need for us to recognize that the regulator should not be too powerful the way it is here. I think that's an important aspect. Besides, he's been talking about spectrum being a resource item. I think that's an analog argument. In today's days of technology, spectrum is no longer that, because there's so much of spectrum that is used by people that are not licensed. Social media is not licensed, and they're using a lot of spectrum. So the question of, if we don't regulate, spectrum will finish. And what do you say about those that are not licensed, like the social media? So I think it's just an attempt to reduce the freedom of broadcasters, which to me runs counter to Section 39 of our Constitution. We should be able to be free to, have information and also spread that information. There's no reason why we should have, like for example, he referred to the Electoral Act, which reproduces some of the aspects of the NBC Act. I don't think that INEC will find somebody. He will only draw attention to the fact that you have committed something, and it will take you to those who can find out whether you have really done so. So I think that's an aspect that is worrisome to me.
Anyway, yeah, quickly, you forgot to introduce Professor Iredia as, I think he's the president of the International Press Organization, and I think that he's using this opportunity to do some kind of media advocacy, which is okay. But I think you got something wrong when you were talking about spectrum. The point I made is that spectrum is a valuable resource, right? All over the world, spectrum is highly valuable. When they are auctioning frequencies across the world, you know what happens? Tons of money is paid for usage of spectrum. So that spectrum is a valuable asset is not an analog argument. Perhaps it's your understanding of the value of spectrum, you know, that you need to probably upgrade.
No, I think there's a new argument.
Secondly, sir.
I think there's a new argument that you have not followed.
Secondly,
I
Prof.
need to put that before you go. There's a new argument you are not following. People in the industry are arguing that licensing is no longer necessary. The reason being that you can't really regulate spectrum.
But that does not diminish the value of the spectrum.
Yeah, there are so many people using it.
It doesn't reduce the value of spectrum.
Why are you stopping certain persons when you cannot stop others?
The other point, Maupe, that he attempted to make with regards to laws and the legality of law, especially of the regulator imposing fines, he understands, like I do, that all over the world, part of the regulatory imperative, you know, for control or even for regulation, is that there must be deterrence. Apart from caution, apart from warning, even the FCC of America that prides itself as the bastion of democracy, they also engage in fining. So it's a global phenomenon. And the only way to change that, perhaps, if Nigeria wants to make itself a different country, is to reenact the laws and probably take away.
Are you taking into cognizance the changing nature of these things? Because if broadcasters are already facing competition from
licensed bodies.
Yes, from even social media apps such as Instagram. There's Instagram TV now. You cannot stop that. Are you taking into cognizance the fact that these new mediums are developing and could actually be some sort of competition and well, I don't know, a disadvantage of some sort for already existing or licensed broadcasters?
Yeah, I do agree with you. Only last week at the Godfrey Okoye University, I did a keynote paper where I was talking about the converged media, you know, and the implications for the broadcast sector. The entry points now are very open. Anybody can enter into the space. Anybody, as I was saying during my paper, people now go around and set up radio and TV stations online, right? But online distribution, right, internet distribution also has its own limitations. And widely put, whether you are obtaining license or not, there's a cost that's involved, which is still the spectrum cost. Even if you are broadcasting online, you are going to incur cost of data to broadcast and even to receive.
Is this still, can we compare that with, I mean, whatever it is you incur in terms of data to what you incur with a license, with a broadcast license, for instance?
Yeah, well, it depends on which matrix you are using. If you are, for instance, like a transmitter or a content provider that like Netflix, right, that does over-the-top distribution, or you are doing something on Google, you have capacity to reach millions of people around the world. But the idea is, does it also have the spread that you can, the instantaneous spread that you can get in a terrestrial broadcast, where, for instance, you have a network license in Nigeria, and as you are making like your TV channel everywhere you are in the country, you tune, and people are getting it real time, on time. You know, so there's the question of malleability. There's the constraint of spectrum when you are dealing with online. Sometimes you find out that where the network isn't too good, there's some freezing, there's no delivery, instant delivery. So the mathematics is there, but the point basically is that yes, we agree that the licensing framework is a bit threatened because it's a superhighway. People enter at any point. But every country also has is a responsibility, you know, to also monitor and regulate its own territorial environment. Otherwise, you will make your landscape, your broadcast landscape, open to all kinds of influx. And I know countries that are even disallowing online services from entering their countries. Saudi Arabia, China.
And those are the kind of countries that we want to follow. But let us quickly go to Lagos and take a question from my colleague. Kimba?
Yeah, Professor Idachaba, I just want to get your thoughts on this because the government has made it very absolutely clear that we're heading towards the digitization era in the broadcast media space. What relevance do you see the NBC playing in that regard?
Great question. Digitization again opens the frontier for the maximization of broadcast benefits. And again, like we were saying, we live in an era of a converged media, right? Where you are able to do sound, data, and video at the same time. And digitization, because of digital compression, allows everybody, anywhere you are, to be able to maximize these benefits. And again, it allows quick deployment of broadcast facilities. The idea we have to digitize Nigeria broadcasting is one in which we will build a broadcast infrastructure, a broadcast signal distribution infrastructure throughout the country. And we also have this idea of setting up what you call decoders or set-top boxes, that can grant for you interactiveness, with the audiences. You are also able to post information services. You are able to download video. So we believe strongly, and we have seen the example in all the states where we have rolled out, that this digitization of the broadcast sector enhances the possibility of Nigerian citizens to maximize the benefits that technology can offer with regards to advancing the gains of broadcasting. And what are those gains? They are not just in the area of entertainment, also of political education, also of citizenry participation in governance. And we think that these social imperatives, political imperatives, economic imperatives are as important as also the entertainment imperative. And it is the desire of the Nigerian government to ensure that the structure, the distribution pattern of the digital platform gets across the entire country, irrespective of class. What we have now in the broadcast sector, basically, is one in which a lot of Nigerians may be disenfranchised in regards to access to digital content. MultiChoice is digitized broadcaster, StarTimes is digitized broadcast. People who pay subscription, some heavy subscription to be able to access. The government, in its wisdom, thinks that poor Nigerians, ordinary people in rural Nigeria, should also have access, to some of this modern technology and access to delivery digital content. So that's where we are now.
Let me also get the thoughts of Dr. Iredia, because a lot of people, Professor Iredia, my apologies, because a lot of people are really concerned about how this digitization is going to play out at the end. Do you think that with digitization, there will be any relevance in sorting out issues of licensing, payment of fees and penalties as it is with the NBC, as it is constituted now or structured?
Well, thank you very much, Gimba. I think that what Armstrong Dachaba is saying here, as far as I'm concerned, is not something that is really unusual. Here is an officer who is still in service and who has a responsibility to defend his organization. And all the things he has been saying today is to tell you what they are doing there and what they want to continue to do. But I think that a program such as yours, which you have mounted today, should be an opportunity for NBC to learn certain lessons about how other people feel about what they're doing. For example, he has introduced me a while ago, but he forgot to say that I am a lawyer. And because I am a lawyer, there are things I know which NBC is not taking any lessons from. Each time the NBC takes a broadcaster to court, it's very difficult for NBC to win because the NBC does not follow the principles of natural justice. Most of the time, they are judges in their own courts. Most of that times, they don't hear the other side of the story. So it's important that we should begin to say, why is it like this? Why must we continue like that? Whether it's digitization, whatever it is, if we don't look at the powers of the regulator and how it is composed, something is wrong. The EU said something about NBC being given authority to do the entire gamut of regulation. Mm-hmm. Why is it that in Nigeria, NBC cannot grant license, yet it can take that license away? It means the NBC is used as a tool, to take the license of opposing opinions. That's the way people will look at it. Whether we like it or not, that is the way people are going to look at it. So if NBC is in charge, let NBC be in charge. And if NBC is in charge, let the people in NBC be impartial. We can't have an NBC that has politicians in between and who want to sanction other bodies that are not the same political party with them. When I mentioned this at the beginning, Idachaba complained that I was talking about generally all the people. Of course, what am I talking about? Gatemen and cameramen? No, I'm talking about those who make policy decisions. And once they are there, no matter how genuine, no matter how relevant, whatever they say is, everybody's entitled to thinking that there's a motive behind it. And I think that is the most important thing in all this discussion. What is NBC? What is it supposed to be doing? How is it doing it? What powers does it have? In which way, how can one have a redress? So those are the things. NBC cannot, act like just a policeman. We have to have some ways by which we can make it easy. Otherwise, the fees you talked about, they are such that the ordinary man he's talking about cannot get it.
I'm looking at this. I think I found the term I was looking for. It was something that had to do with campaign coverage with the Nigerian Broadcasting Code and the Elections Act. But let's look at this. It says both require political broadcasts, including advertising and paid programs, to confirm with vague standards of decency and good taste. They say those standards are vague. Do you agree with them, Professor Idachaba?
Yeah, decency and good taste sometimes can be subjective, right? But you and I know what is indecent.
You
and I...
We might not be agreed on it.
Exactly. That's why I said it could be subjective. But if I made a comment that is uncomplimentary to you, or I go to make a comment that you find offensive, regarding your morality.
Something might be offensive, but could be true.
We are not talking about we are talking about decency. Decency has to do with the quality of communication, right? Whether it is done in good faith, whether it is done in a way that is insulting or abusive, or whether it is done in a way that can instantly gravitate repulsiveness. And that is why I said it could be subjective.
Which broadcast could then again be even more subjective, because what you say and how you say it, the how oftentimes is even more important than what you're saying. So how do you then judge that, even if the person were saying something nice but was being sarcastic, for instance?
You see, and that is the point.
Yeah.
The broadcasters like you, and there are many of them, I don't scapegoat you, but I know there are many, that actually leave the responsibility, for regulation, to the ombudsman, to the government agency. We know as practitioners that there are certain ethics that are imbued in you, as a broadcaster. As you learn the ropes, as you go through it, you know things that are ethical and things that are unethical. You don't have to be reminded by statute. Unfortunately, you may find situations where some people abdicate this self-editorial responsibility, and on their own get indecent and make very offensive, derogatory remarks. And we say broadcasters should refrain from making things that would sound indecent. I agree with the EU report, and that is why they say, for instance, that they appear vague, right? And that is the point I made regarding the fact that it could be subjective. The point would be for the broadcaster, to also exercise self-restraint. And we preach that a lot.
Self-censorship, you mean?
No, well, I hate to use censorship because I hate to use censorship, self-restraint, in a way that you will ask yourself, what I'm about to say or what I'm allowing to be said, if it was said to me or to my father and my mother, will it be acceptable? Would I not find it repulsive? So there has to be some professional self-re-examination regarding even the broadcasters, how they allow words to be used, and how the words that they use, and how they also interface in their engagements with even people who interface with their stations. I see a lot of that these days, especially on phone-in programs.
I want to find out from you, Prof. Is there any policy now looking at increasing? I mean, right now the EU is saying that this costs are prohibitive for licensing fees. It does seem that there is a policy direction to increase it even further. You're not looking at coming down, are you?
No, we think that with digitization, the cost for the license fee for broadcasters definitely will have to go down. Digitization also offers maximum space for new entrants into the broadcast system, right? Because with digitization, you have pluralism of channels, where a spectrum, a frequency where you used to probably put only channels, you can now put like 5 other broadcast stations on that same channel. So when you talk about the value of that spectrum, the new people who enter into the spectrum definitely will share the cost of spectrum. So we are, we are determined, and we are going to ensure that with digitization, as more people come in, the entry points are going to be lower. Definitely so.
But in the meantime?
Well, in the meantime, like I told you from the beginning, the economics are very clear. For regions, areas where there is no economic activity, and areas that are heavily challenged, of course, the licensing regime is lower.
What I'm asking is it going to be status quo in the meantime, or are you looking at increasing it?
Increasing. I told you that we are contemplating a reduction, because we are contemplating a reduction.
We have to be very clear.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an issue you raised which appeared to have been overlooked, and that is the issue of whether or not these rules are vague. I think when the rules are general, there's a tendency for them to be vague. But when we go into specificity, because for us, pioneers in this business, we have a different picture of what we had in mind when we talked about, good taste and decency. We're looking at sensibilities. There are certain things you cannot say to certain people in certain aspects of the country. And you have to be careful about those, composition of those areas. You can't be insensitive to the feelings and perhaps belief system of people. That's an aspect that is not vague. We all know it. Then there's a question of intemperate language. You cannot be putting on air people who are shouting at one another or who are abusive, right, and who are saying things that are uncooked or that are defamatory of other people. Again, there's the issue of dressing. You can't dress anyhow on TV. You can't do whatever you like on TV. We don't expect that Mokwe, for example, will come on air and start to do something like this. I mean, it's not done on TV. Those are the kinds of things that we should be looking out for. Those are the things really that enhance professionalism, not administrative control.
But when the space is getting even open, and you're privy to what is happening right now, when you see things like Big Brother, this is without any any criticism of what is happening there, but when you see that viewers are tuned in there, and that is what a certain demographic likes to watch, how do you say we begin to merge what is happening in those spaces with what we term professional, for instance?
That's the challenge, because really, what do you give to people? Is it what you want them to hear or see, or what they want to hear or what they want to see? And that's the main challenge that you are bringing up. You see sometimes people talk about hate speech. And for me, most of the times that I've heard hate speech, what I hear is that something that somebody doesn't like. That's not hate. The fact that you don't like it doesn't mean that it's hate speech. Or the fact that it's not something that is complementary to you, it doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, the truth is primal, and we should look at such things. We want to make progress. We cannot sit down and be regulating certain environments for other people. It is not what my generation would like to watch on TV, that of my children would like to watch. And we have to look at the viewer is the king. So what are you serving the viewer? When there's too much regulation, there's too much laws here and there, without giving enough room to what he has called self-regulation, you are actually giving the impression that the media professional is not competent. And he has to be guided almost in everything he does before he can do what is right. And yet, he's a professional.
Again, let me quickly take you back as we close now, as we wrap up now. I want to ask you, what do you think needs to be done to transform the national broadcasters into genuine public service outfits?
Well, for me, the word or the proper term there is genuine. And that is what is missing. And that is why I emphasize composition, I emphasize structure, right? With due respect, if I had Idachaba as Director General of NBC, I don't think I would have a problem. But because I know he's not partisan, and I know that when he says certain things, he might be able to explain it to my satisfaction.
Yeah, but couldn't he become partisan?
Yeah, when he becomes that, he shouldn't be.
Because of the fact that, he could be removed at the whims and caprices of whoever is there. Who wants to lose his or her job?
Yeah, but you see, if he can be removed in that way, then he's not the man for there. And then also, the man removing him ought to be cautioned. And that's why we're saying the ability to put an agent to be regulating people in such a way that whipping people onto line does not create equity and fairness, does not create room for balance and objectivity, does not create room for free flow of information, which is what all this law about freedom of speech is all about.
Oh, I derailed you on that, definition, or talking about the term genuine for the national broadcasters. But gentlemen, we're totally out of time. I have to thank you both for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning and sharing your very genuine thoughts on the recommendations of
so
the
you know what
EU
is genuine
monetary of the EU Monetary Committee. But thank you so much. We've been speaking with Professor Tony Iredia, who was a former Director General of the Nigeria Television Authority and is currently the visiting professor at Igbinedion University. We also had with us Professor Armstrong Idachaba, who is the Director of Broadcast Monitoring at the National Broadcasting Commission. That's the Sunrise Daily for this segment. It continues in a moment. Please stay with us.